What's up, fellow Hoops gamers? This video is a continuation of a series I'm doing on my channel where I'm seeking to determine how much your shot release timing impacts your probability of making or missing a shot. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend viewing part 1, where I go over the assumptions and methods I used to obtain the data that I got. It's linked in the description. So after last video, a lot of you were left wondering whether shooting from mid-range or three-point, or shooting with good or bad shooters would change the effect that your shot release timing had on the shot percentage, if that makes sense. These are the questions I'll be addressing for you here today. So to try and determine whether shot release timing impacts good and bad shooters differently, I used two different players to do a test. First was Vlade Divac from the 91 Lakers, who has a 62 three-point rating. And second was Steph Curry's long-lost cousin, Steve Chili, who I gave a 90 rating. I actually created Steve Chili with a purpose, though, other than for us to mock him. But with a created player, I'm able to change one attribute at a time while keeping everything else equal, and that's exactly what I did for the mid-range test. So for the bad shooters, I used him with a 60 mid-range, and for the good shooter test, I used him with a 90. So if you watched my last video, you'll be very familiar with how I do these shooting tests. But to go over it quickly, I just do X amount of best and worst case yellow releases. So in other words, I shoot X amount of times, in this case it was 600 for each, when the yellow bar is touching the white line to kind of determine a baseline, and then do the same for the earliest possible release. So using this method, I came up with quite a lot of data to compare good and bad shooters from both three-point and from mid-range. This is probably best displayed as a graphic, which you'll see here. Sorry, I know it's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but what I really want you to focus on is the differential column. Initially, I thought the penalty for missing the white line on your shot release would be proportional to the baseline shooting percentage, but as you see here, there's a whole lot of evidence to the contrary. So instead, it seems like the game penalizes a poor shot release equally, no matter who the shooter is, whether it be Steph Curry, Steve Chili, Vinny Del Negro, whoever, or where you're shooting from. So no matter what, it seems like it's going to be a flat reduction of 11%. It's tough to say exactly, but somewhere between 14 and 15% on your overall shot percentage. Now, obviously, you're not either going to just have a yellow release that's exactly on the white line or another one that's the worst yellow release possible. There's stuff in between, right? So I got into this in my last video, but from all the evidence I've gathered, it seems like it's kind of a linear progression between the worst yellow release and the best. This means that a release at the exact midpoint of the two releases we've described, the best and the worst, would be about a 7% penalty. So, i.e., the midpoint between 0% penalty when it's touching the white line and the 14% penalty on the worst case release. So I've thrown a bunch of data at you, but I haven't really got into how this information will apply practically in a game setting. Since it appears that the shot meter applies a flat penalty regardless of how close or far your shot is from the rim, or the ability of the shooter, I would argue that the worse shooter you're using, and the further you are from the rim, the more important it is to get a good release. So if you're shooting a 3 with Vlade Divac, whose baseline three-point percentage is only 35% or so, that 14% penalty is almost going to effectively half the chance that you make that shot. Whereas if you're using a mid-range sniper like Steve Chili, for instance, who has a mid-range baseline percentage of 61%, then knocking 14 off that isn't going to screw up your chances quite in the same way, because you'll still be left at 47, which is fairly a high percentage still. If you're still struggling with this concept, try to think of it like this. A millionaire losing $50 isn't going to be affected in nearly the same way as someone who loses that same sum who only has, let's say, $100 in their bank account. It's the exact same concept, but just on a much less extreme scale. So I hope all this information came across clearly to you guys. I hope I didn't confuse too many of you. If you have any questions or are confused, feel free to leave a comment. I'll do my best to clear up anything for you. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful, perhaps I've earned your like. And if you find this kind of information useful in general, feel free to subscribe. I will be doing a new video every single week. Make sure to join me next week where I'll be covering the mysterious green release.